Hi everyone, it's great to be back with a video today. I've had a couple of days off, I was busy at the weekend I'm afraid, so I'm returning today with this brand new series. It's Magnus Carlsen playing against Levon Aronian. Now it was played in 2020, this is the Banter Blitz semi-final, and this is another round of Banter Blitz games that they did after the one earlier in the year. So there was that famous final, Alireza against Magnus, played in March 2020. This was September 2020, and I covered those games, by the way. I'll link that playlist at the end in case you haven't seen it. And before I get cracking with this video here, shout out to Michael Holland. Thanks very much for joining up with a membership to the channel. I will be playing some Blitz chess against members soon, so if you do want to get involved, do consider membership. And there's also some great options there around coaching if you want that bit more interaction. But without further ado, Magnus had white here. He kicks off with 1d4. Now Levon goes knight f6, and we quickly go down this Grunfeld line. So we had pawn g6, knight c3, and d5 starts the Grunfeld defense. So Magnus goes knight f3, bishop g7 from Levon. And by the way, they've only got 3 minutes on the clock, plus increment, I think a couple of seconds per move. Now we had h4 from Magnus, and he says at this point, I don't really know this stuff, but I'm going to go for it. Now we had c6 from Levon. So you can take there and go for some very sharp lines, but Levon says he wants to stay solid. Now Magnus takes here, the pawn recaptures, and he goes bishop f4, and already at this moment he says, I should be doing okay here now, with Levon having just played the kind of solid way, because although I've arguably weakened my position with h4, my bishop is more active here than my opponent's, so that's playing in my favour. So knight c6 from Levon. Now we had pawn e3, castles played, and now the queen came to b3, so it probes against that b7 pawn, and we can already see the annoyance of the bishop on f4 cutting across that diagonal. So pawn b6 was now played, covers the attack, also prepares to develop the bishop. Magnus just develops, bishop b7, and now castles from Magnus, so he abandons any ideas of pushing h5 in the future. He just wants to play positionally here, and Levon has a decision to make now about how to start unravelling the pieces. He could go rook c8, pawn e6, these are things he looked at, but he goes for the more active move here. It's how he likes to play, knight to e4, and you don't want to start chopping off here, or then black can go knight to a5, you hit the queen, and you also open up the bishop. You're actually losing a piece here as white. So instead Magnus brings the rook across. You also don't want to take, by the way, because after pawn recaptures, if you go knight g5, you're not actually winning that pawn, because pawn h6 can come, and if you snaffle this one off, well then there's this knight d4 trick, again opening up that bishop, hitting the queen, so you could have a line like this, and suddenly these black bishops have come to life. White's got the weakness here, so not how you want to go. Rook fc1 from Magnus played. Now we had pawn e6, bishop d3 from Magnus, so a nice solid improving move, puts a question to this knight, and you don't actually have to move it away straight away, again due to tactics down this diagonal, but Levon just decides to drop back here, and now knight b5 played from Magnus. So already he's got this small edge in the position, because if black takes this one, the bishop recaptures, and you're pressuring down here already. The rooks are better than the black rooks, both of the white bishops are better than their counterparts, so just a nibbling edge there for white. So instead Levon plays this knight to c4 move, trying to mix things up tactically and open up this bishop down the wonderful diagonal. This is the right, really nice positional play about this. So Magnus chops that one off, and now it looks like you're just losing a pawn here as black, but knight a5, this is Levon's trick. So you hit the queen, Magnus looked at queen b4, but then he drops to d1, again just really nice stuff, so that after pawn recaptures, which Levon played, opening his bishop, now the queen actually defends the knight on f3, and you could have actually captured this one, after knight d6 hitting the bishop, now you could actually capture this one here, queen recaptures, pick up a pawn, but white can chop this one, and again white's just doing quite well here. You're first to the file, you've got the better bishop, etc. So Levon didn't go for that one. Instead he went bishop d5. Another really tricky move here, so holds the pawn but walks straight into e4. What's the big idea? Well, at least now you've slightly weakened this one, it gets quite tactical. So the bishop drops back to c6 and Magnus now goes pawn b4. You can actually go d5 here as well, although positionally when you haven't got a lot of time you're always very hesitant to open up that dark squared bishop. So instead we had b4. Hits the knight, and if you capture en passant, this is actually helping white because b4 is still coming and now you've opened this rook down the a file. So instead Levon just retreated this knight here, he challenges the one on d6 and pawn b5 from Magnus. Again, just an excellent move here, really feeling the tactics, and he expected just takes from Levon. Then you can capture this bishop here, but black takes here, white takes here. Again, white should be doing better here with this passed c-pawn, but still a very tactical, tense position. But instead of taking on d6, Levon here played bishop to d5. Just a crazy looking move, but the whole idea is that after captures here, well, now Levon can actually take that knight. And by the way, just briefly running it back here, if you did try and take this one and then pick up the bishop, well, now the bishop recaptures. This is the trick. So instead we had takes, knight takes, pawn captures here, and now Levon picks up on b5. So it's all getting crazy, but Magnus is better here if he plays rook takes on c4, because then he holds his d4 pawn. Yes, Levon can take here, but it's a better pawn structure for white, slight edge there. But instead of doing this one, Magnus just goes kind of chest blind here. He plays pawn a4 and he literally says, wow, what am I doing? This is now dicey, and they're both down to about 20 seconds each after Levon takes here, and we get the position just getting kind of crazy now. So Magnus flicks in this bishop g5 move. Now if you go f6, which he was maybe trying to provoke, well then you can take on d4, pawn captures, rook takes here, suddenly white's doing okay again. But if you do what Levon did, then Magnus is struggling, because you can throw in this in between check, the queen recaptures, and now Levon took on e6. Excellent move, so you're opening up the rook to hit the queen, and Magnus couldn't really see anything better here than chopping on d8, letting his own one go. Now looks like he's winning an exchange, but the problem is the bishop is on the rook in the corner. So we had captures on f3, now takes on a1, bishop g5, this one dropped back. Yes, Magnus wins a pawn, but look at this rock solid bishop on c5, and Levon is still a pawn ahead in this position. So bishop e3 played, challenging that one. The rook came to c8, Magnus goes a5, he takes the chance to get rid of that pawn, because if you capture here, you're losing a piece here. So instead the king marched in. We had these pawns exchanged. Now king g2. Both players bring the kings in. And again Magnus takes the opportunity to get rid of a weakness. Now Levon captures that one and Magnus swings across, looking to just mix things up really. Open up the king, try and get some checks in, split those pawns. But Levon is 2 pawns ahead here and this should be converted. So rook g8 check played. The king came to h3. The rook came back to f8, hits this pawn, and now Magnus goes for this one. Chops with check, pawn recaptures, he takes on h5, we had rook takes f3 check, and now Magnus abandons this pawn with king g4, so that if Levon takes here, Magnus takes here. Now still black is completely in the driving seat of course, but this was one way to try and make the draw. Instead Levon didn't take on f2, he drops back with rook to f5, he leaves this pawn to get taken, king d6, and now he's banking on this c pawn, just winning him the game. The problem is that the white king is cut, and the black king is getting super active now in this position. So pawn f4 from Magnus, c4 from Levon. Now the rook comes back, it wants to swing behind here, but Levon starts marching, king and pawn, check was played. By the way, if you come straight behind the pawn here, well now we can always defend like this, then we'll carry on marching in the king. So we had this one instead, king f3 now played, so Magnus tries to come back around, king c4, king e3, now rook d5, Magnus chucks in a check, but the rook now nudges back across. It's just so impossible to actually stop this pawn when the king's so close to it. Rook b8 played, stops the king coming to the b file, so Levon goes rook c6. He just holds this pawn for a moment, and now he's preparing this move again to cut the white king, then he can start advancing the pawn. King e2 played, rook d6. Magnus checks, but now the king wanders in, and there's just nothing that Magnus can do here. This is one of the best defences, but there really isn't a defence essentially. And the king comes all the way across now, hits this c1 square, rook c8, pawn c2, and now you just can't stop the black king from actually either marching this way or marching this way with the protection of the rook. So first rook d4 plays, the classic Lucena position. The king's here, the rook's on the fourth, and you're going to use it to build a bridge if you need to do so. So king e3 was played, hits that rook, rook c4, and you can't carry on harassing or then you lose this pawn. So rook b6 was played, hits this one, but now king d1 gives the pawn if Magnus wants it, because the king is then headed here. So rook d6 check, king e1, the rook took here now. Levon makes a queen on c1, Magnus goes king d3, and now king d1 was played, and here Magnus notes that there's no stalemate trick, because if you go rook e1, king takes, well the problem is you can still push a pawn, but if there was no pawn there, well then this would actually be stalemate, which would be quite a funny finish. So Levon takes the first game here in this Banter Blitz. If you want to see another amazing series between Magnus and Ali Reza, click here, and subscribe to the channel, do see below. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.